Okay, so just like the lactic acid fermentation, alcoholic fermentation is a form of what chemical process that cells use to make energy?
Cellular respiration.
It's a form of cellular respiration. But unlike the cellular respiration that's done in your body most of the time, or in most vertebrate bodies, or most creature bodies, this is cellular respiration that happens without a critical component. What's the component? Oxygen, yeah. So this is anaerobic. So this is done by cells that can't get enough oxygen, and there are some cells that just do anaerobic respiration that have, that have evolved to respire in the absence of oxygen, and for whom oxygen would actually be a crisis. It would kill them. They talk about in Earth history the great oxygen crisis, when we had this sudden sort of flowering of oxygen in the atmosphere, and that for a lot of organisms this was bad news because they couldn't deal with oxygen. It was toxic. So, anaerobic cellular respiration, which means what are they putting in and what are they getting out? Okay, so if we're naming products, one product is alcohol, and specifically it's ethanol. What are some other products? What's the little chemical that we've talked about a little bit again and again, cells use for energy? 3 initials.
Carbon dioxide.
We do get carbon dioxide, but the chemical that the cells use for energy, so I'll add that there. ATP. I heard it. Yeah, so we get out of this alcohol, CO2, and a little bit of ATP. Not a whole lot, but some, which is why some cells can get away with just doing this. What goes into this process? What's necessary? Sugar, yeah, glucose. So, and then there are some other chemicals that are manufactured in the body that are used. But basically, cells can do this in the absence of oxygen. In cellular respiration, it's glucose plus oxygen gets us, CO2 and ATP and all that. Here, it's really just glucose. That's what the cells need. And, sugar, fructose or sucrose, Gesundheit, white table sugar is a great source of glucose because it's just glucose and fructose put together. But white flour works. White flour is easily broken down into glucose. And if you know anybody who is a type 2 diabetic, one of the things that they're often told is you shouldn't be eating refined grains, no white flour, no white rice, because those things are converted to glucose by the body pretty fast. And so they're supposed to eat more whole grains, things that have some fiber to kind of slow that process down in the body. Okay, so we're taking glucose, we're breaking it down, we're going to get some alcohol out of it and some CO2. Are those what these organisms are after? No. That's just waste. That's just waste products. So these are both waste products. And the little bit of ATP that they get is really what these organisms are going for. And the organisms in question, again, are yeasts. What do we know about yeasts?
It's used in bread.
Okay, it's used in bread. What else do we know? Are these insects? Are these bacteria? Are these, what are these? Are they multicellular? Are they unicellular? Do they have backbones? Do they have civilizations?
They might.
Who knows?
Underground yeast people.
Sure. They're fungi. Yeast are a form of fungus. And they are single-celled. They are unicellular. They reproduce asexually. And the form of asexual reproduction that they undergo is what's called budding. So they have, they are eukaryotes. They do have some cell structures that we would recognize. They have a nuclei. They have some of those organelles. But they still reproduce asexually. And when they bud, they recreate all the organelles. They split. They basically, a small bubble grows off the main body of a yeast, and then it gets pinched off, and then you have a smaller yeast that just grows to size. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward. There are many hundreds of species of yeast. So we say yeast like it's one thing. There are hundreds of species of yeasts, and they all produce other. So when we go back to this, they also produce some other chemicals. And there are minor trace things called ketones. And ketones are strong-smelling organic chemicals. Who here has ever smelled nail polish remover? Okay. That is acetone, which is a ketone. Could any of you, if I opened a bottle of nail polish remover, immediately go, nail polish remover? It's got a distinctive, very strong odor. Ketones in general have distinctive, strong odors. And some of the more subtle flavors. Anybody else a raw bread dough snitcher? Yes, I got one. It's not as common as raw cookie dough. A lot of people don't like raw bread dough. I love raw bread dough. And my daughter seems to too. So we always snitch a little bit because I bake bread. And there are all these like weird subtle little flavors, especially after it's risen. And a lot of those are the little waste product chemicals that the yeast is kicking off. So, I mean, it's producing a little bit of alcohol. Don't worry, my 4-year-old's not getting drunk on bread dough. But it's producing also these other little subtle flavors. And so you get these little ketones that are part of that flavor profile. For people who brew beverages using yeasts, they are looking at specific strains of yeast that will produce the flavor profile they want. Most artificial fruit flavors, if you've ever had something that was artificially fruit flavored, like candy, Skittles, something like that, those are ketones that are used as flavorings. They're organic chemicals. They are not derived from yeasts. They're made in a lab someplace, but they're pretty easy to make. And so typically a first-year organic chemistry lab involves making artificial fruit flavors. And when I did it, you got an unknown sample. You had to run through a series of steps, and you were going to basically produce one of 4 different ketones. And there was grape, pear, lemon, or apple. And your final product should smell like one of those. And you had to then run some tests on it and determine which ketone you had and see if it smelled right. I had pear. I still remember that after all these years. But those other little chemicals are responsible for some real subtle flavors. Okay, so I start off with just a couple of yeast cells in my little ecosystem. And my ecosystem could be my mixing bowl that has my flour and my other ingredients to make a loaf of bread. My ecosystem could be a 2-liter bottle with some sugar in it and some water to make root beer. I start off with just a few yeast cells. We're probably going to use about a teaspoonful of yeast cells. Now, how many yeast cells are in there? Well, quite a lot. The individual grains you see are not individual cells. That's clusters of cells that have been dried and inactivated. We give them all the food they could possibly want. What's going to happen? No predators, all the food they could possibly want. How are they going to grow? Exponentially. Can they keep growing that way forever? So we're not going to have predators in the bottle with them. We don't have predators in a loaf of bread for them. What happens to the yeast cells in our bottle? What are the possibilities? Well, they could reach carrying capacity and then kind of level off, and then we would see this behavior because whatever in their source of food is now balanced, and we have a balanced ecosystem. Is our bottle of root beer ever going to be a balanced ecosystem? No. Is something adding more sugar to it continually? No. So, first problem. At some point, what do? They eat all the food. So, at the point when they eat all the food, we see this. That's one thing that can happen. You can have a population crash because they eat all the food. There's another thing that can happen. They're making a couple of byproducts. What are those byproducts? CO2 and alcohol. So CO2 can be toxic to some organisms in certain concentrations. Alcohol can be toxic to some organisms. And in fact, it's the alcohol that's the problem here. If they had a continual supply of food, we kept adding sugar, they could eventually produce so much alcohol that they would all die. because they would just basically be cooked in their own alcohol. So that's the other thing. Basically, there's no good ending for the yeast that we're using for root beer making or bread baking. One way or another, we're going to end up, if we just let them go, killing them all. Now, what we're going to do, because remember that population is growing, because they're at the right conditions of temperature, they have enough food, so individuals are growing, individuals are reproducing. We're going to let them go a couple days, and then we're going to stick them in the fridge. What happens to their population growth then? It stops. But we're not killing them, and they're not continuing to eat themselves out of house and home. They're not continuing to produce alcohol. It's just going to level off. So, put them in the fridge. Now, if we leave them in the fridge for a week and then get them back out of the fridge, what's going to happen? It's going to go right back up because their conditions will have changed. And they'll be back in sort of that green zone where they can reproduce freely. They're all growing. Their population's growing. And then, we would see that. We're not going to do that because there's a risk of the bottle exploding, and we don't want bottles of exploding root beer. I can tell you from personal experience, the stuff is sticky as all get out, and we have made a mess before. We're going to try our best not to make a mess. Best of luck, huh? Okay. So that's your sort of preview. Tomorrow, you'll have a whole lab handout on doing the root beer. Like I said, we do have enough bottles. I'll go get the root beer extract and some fresh yeast tonight. Yeast does get old. It's a living thing. It's in a dormant phase, but things can't live in a dormant phase forever. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, and we'll do a yeast culture tomorrow. That's it for today. I'll let you work on whatever else you want to work on, and I'm going to sit here and keep slugging through projects. Questions? Comments? Yes, sir.